So we briefly discussed about what a difference between a theory and a model is, and we talked about what are the three issues that a speech production model should address, and they are the serial order issue, the degrees of freedom, and the context sensitivity problem. So here are some of the models, and we're going to go in and we're going to talk about some of these models here. And I would say I'm not going to cover all of these models in depth. I took an entire semester talking about these models as part of my PhD program. There is so much in-depth information about these models. So what I'm going to do is very briefly talk about a model, give what the basic strategy of the model, give an example of such a model, and I think might mention for some of those if the model addresses certain of those issues, and I want you to just pay attention to those, and I think that should be good to just understand broadly that there are different speech production models that exist in our field. Okay. So the connectionist model is one model where we use computer models to study neural processing of the human brain. This is a well-studied model. A lot of models under this connectionist model is a broad model, and there are lots of other sub-models that follow under this. But I'm just going to talk broadly and give you one classic example of the connectionist model. Under the connectionist model, the assumption is that it's a parallel distributed processing model, meaning how complex our speech is. In order to be able to keep up with the rate of speech, in order to convey the information that we want to convey, the steps for speech production are not processed sequentially, but they're actually processed more or less in parallel. Okay, we talked about this, right? We said, what is co-articulation? When one or two articulators, more than two articulators move at the same time to produce two different speech sounds, that becomes co-articulation. That means there is a temporal meaning timing, overlap between those speech sounds, between those movements of different articulators. So this model, when we talk about the parallel processing, which means everything happens in parallel, not as a series or not in sequential order, it permits for context sensitivity, which means it's co-articulation, and it does not increase the degree of freedom. Remember our goal when we talked about degrees of freedom is to actually decrease the degrees of freedom in our speech production. So with the connectionist model, you're looking at a computer model that talks about neural processing of the brain. The assumption of this model is that speech production happens in a parallel way. It's processed more or less in a parallel way rather than a sequential way. It accounts for context sensitivity and it decreases the degrees of freedom. Okay, so it addresses two of those factors. A classic example of the connectionist model is called the spreading activation model. Okay, and an example of the spreading activation model is called the Dell's model. It came up in 1986. Now, according to the spreading activation model, what it says is that there are different weighted networks. Okay, now when I say about all this, it's going to be so confusing, so I'm going to try to keep it very brief. So think about nodes, think about different circles in your brain that is getting activated when you want to say a particular word. So for example, I want to say the word cat. Now think about all these circles that can get activated to relate to cat. You have semantic, which is meaning. So you're talking about fur, it's a fur-like animal, it is a small animal, or it could be the bigger animal, cat, like the lions and the tigers, that family, right? And then it is, so it could be a domestic animal or a wild animal, so it can be a pet or a wild animal. And then you're talking about what sound it makes, spurs. All of these at one point, you don't realize it, but all of these at one point get activated, and then the phonemes that related to the word cat also gets activated. Like, it's a stop, right? So all stop sounds might get activated. Then the vowel sound a might get activated in addition to the closer form and frequency vowel sounds. Then t is also a stop sound that gets activated. And then there are weightage for all these activations. The ones that are closely related to the production of cat will have more weightage than the ones that are very less closely related to cat, right? So for example, if I thought about the pet cat, the pet will have more activation, the fur will have more activation, small will have more activation, K sound will have more activation in the initial position, while T sound will have more activation in the final position, things like that. Those activated networks are called nodes, and the ones that have more weightage are the ones that are getting pulled in to actually give your final output, cat. Okay, that is a spreading activation, and Dell's model is a classic example of the spreading activation model. Okay, so let's review this one more time. It looks like a lot, but it's very simple. Think about all of these circles that's on top. So it starts from broader circle and it narrows down like a funnel to the actual word cat that you want to say, which is one circle. Okay, when you think about that word cat that you need to produce, there are lots of things that pop up in your brain in the parallel process, right? Because you can't think about, oh, I'm going to categorize it first as an animal, then I'm going to categorize it as a domestic or wild animal, then I'm going to categorize it as a small or a big animal, then I'm going to categorize. See, those are sequential steps, but connectionist model doesn't believe in sequential steps. Connectional model believes in parallel processing. So all those categories that I mentioned to you are all going to pop up at the same time with different weightage levels. The ones that are more close to actually getting you to produce the word cat will have more weightage than the ones that are not close to getting you to produce that word cat. Similarly, the weightage will also be at the phoneme level. So the weightage is overall broad. It could be semantic level, it could be morphological level, and it could be at the phonological level. Okay, and your final output is going to be the word that you intended to say. Okay. So the basic strategy of the connectionist model is there is an established weighted connection in a large network of interconnected units. All of these units, the semantics, the morphology, the phonology, all of these are interconnected units, and the ones that have the more weighted or more higher weightage will get chosen compared to the ones that have the lower weightage, and those are the ones that help you getting out your final output. Okay. Models most aspect of the speech behavior. It talks about the seeded order, sequencing errors, it talks about co-articulation, it does not increase the degrees of freedom. So which means this model, connectionist model, addresses all three of those issues that a model should address: sequencing, co-articulation, and does not increase degrees of freedom. If I asked you, give me an example of one model that does not, one model that addresses all three issues of speech production, then you're going to have to say that is the connectionist model. Okay? Or if you also give me Dell's model, that's also acceptable. All right? Okay. The next model that we're going to talk about is the dynamic systems model. Now remember that speech is not a simple stringing of sounds. It's not a linear process, but it is a non-linear speech. So this dynamic system model addresses that non-linearity of the speech, meaning it's more complex than just simple stringing of phonemes together. Okay. So an important concept that is addressed by the dynamic systems model is something called synergy. Okay, synergy meaning it works in coordinated groups. That's what synergy means. It's more coordinated, works more in groups. So according to the dynamic systems model, the muscles work in synergy or in groups to achieve a particular task. Okay. We talked about degrees of freedom, and we wanted to, according to our models of speech production, one of the main issues that we want to address is to decrease the degrees of freedom. We don't want each individual muscle to get activated for every single speech sound or every single movement that we do for speech production. So we need to decrease the degrees of freedom. So dynamic system model suggests that the muscles work in synergy or in groups, and that will decrease the degree of freedom. Agreed? If I'm trying to say a particular sound, and I have to move all of these, I'm going to get these muscles to coordinate, like my respiratory muscles, my phonatory muscles, my articulatory muscles. They're all coordinating and working in groups at the same time to be able to produce this complex speech that I'm talking to you right now. If I had to think about moving each single muscle individually every single time I produce, do you think I would have the same rate of speech? Do you think I'd have the same way of effective communication? If I didn't do them in groups. Okay, so think about that. The dynamic system models also, in its model, it allows a great deal of flexibility in how you link the groups, muscle groups. For example, the linkage happens with respect to what your speech output is going to be. So if my speech output is going to be cat, versus my speech output is going to be pataka, versus my speech output is going to be a full sentence like I'm talking right now, the groupings or linkages will change to match your speech output goals. So there is a lot of flexibility in this system. If you talk about it, maybe I will say it addresses the context sensitivity problem. It also decreases the degree of freedom. Okay. The main goal, I think, with this is to decrease the degrees of freedom. So there is a coordinated control of a system. Okay. So for example, the lips and jaw muscles function as a coordinative unit in bilabial closure. What is the basic strategy of the dynamic systems model? It's based on synergies with decreasing degrees of freedom. Okay, so we talked about two models so far, the connectionist model and the dynamic system model. The connectionist model, it's about a computer model that talks about the neural processing in the brain. There are a lot of weighted networks in the brain. Everything lights up, but some have more weightage than the others. The ones that have more weightage are going to get chosen to be able to give your final output. The connectionist model is the one that addresses all three, the serial order issue, the minimizing degrees of freedom, and the context sensitivity problem, right, issue. The dynamic system model talks about how it takes into account the non-linearity of the dynamic process involved in speech. And the main strategy of the dynamic systems model is that it uses muscle groupings or synergies to decrease the degrees of freedom, and your output will determine how the linkage is going to happen. Okay. The next model that we're going to have is the feedback models. Now, we talked about feedback mechanisms. We talked about how there are 4 different kinds of feedback: the auditory feedback, the tactile feedback, the proprioceptive feedback, and the internal feedback. The auditory feedback and the tactile feedback are external feedback mechanisms, meaning they're away at the periphery and more so act as a means to change the output after the fact, while the proprioceptive and internal are more so internal feedback mechanisms that are closer and makes changes as the speech is happening, right? So if we talk about the feedback models, now just think about it. The feedback models transfer of part of the output system to the input system, right? If you remember the open loop and the closed loop system, you have the output, then the output goes back to the input to see if there was any errors in the output. Now, the issue that we already talked about, that feedback, if we talked about the auditory feedback and the tactile feedback, feedback models are relatively slow. Most of the times, the feedback discrepancy is corrected after the fact. We also talked about, for the auditory feedback and the tactile feedback, that if we disrupt our feedback channel, so if we masked our auditory processing, or if I had a bite block in my mouth where I didn't have the ability to have sensory perception of what I was doing with my tactile feedback, speech was still intelligible. So if you think about, if you had a numbing of your mouth in with anesthesia at a dentist's office, you're not getting the tactile feedback from your articulators, but your speech is still intelligible. It might be slightly slurred, but for most part, you understand what you're speaking. So which means, in spite of disruption of the feedback channels, there is an instantaneous compensation. So really, can we account for speech production with feedback models is a question that we have to pose, okay? And some of the believers with speech production models say that speech does not require continuous feedback, okay? So the basic strategy from the feedback model is that the feedback from the periphery ensures that the movement goals are achieved. Feedback allows for correction of movements to achieve desired goals. As a very classic example of the feedback model is the servo system model by Fairbanks in 1954. So in sum, I know I kind of rushed past your feedback model, but I think I rushed past because we've already talked about the feedback mechanisms earlier, so it's easy to talk about the feedback model once you've listened to the feedback mechanisms lecture. So feedback models basically are models that talk about feeding your part of your output back to your input to make sure if there was any discrepancy in how to correct. Feedback models are typically slow. Feedback models happen after the fact. And with feedback models, what happens is that even though there is a disruption in the feedback channel, the speech is pretty much intelligible. So really, do we need post-feedback in order to regulate speech? So if I asked you about the feedback model, you'll give me those disadvantages of the feedback model. And if I asked you what was a classic example of a feedback model, you're going to talk about the servo system model. I mean, you just have to mention the servo system model. So how many models have we covered so far? 3. Connectionist model, dynamic system model, feedback model. What does feedback model account for? Do you think maybe it accounts for serial order issue? Probably does not account for context sensitivity, because if it did, it should be an ongoing correction, not just waiting for the feedback to happen. So mainly I'd say it accounts more so for serial order issue, like slip of the tongue, and then you go back and correct it. Okay? So the next set of models is the target models. With the target models, where speech is basically, according to the target model, speech is nothing but we're trying to attain a sequence of targets that one is attempting to produce. So the target is, I want to say the word can't. Now, I will have to get a sequence of targets corresponding to those speech sounds so I can produce the actual word target. Now, the models have classified targets in terms of spatial targets, auditory acoustic targets, or as abstract targets. So let's talk about each of those. What is a spatial target? What is an auditory acoustic target? Or is that just there's nothing like a spatial or an auditory acoustic target, it's an abstract target. So with target model, you have certain targets that you need to meet. So you are producing the speech sounds to meet that certain target, which is your final output. Okay? So what is a spatial target? What does space mean? Right? Space is spatial, meaning space. In space, you are talking about how to meet targets in space. So in order to produce speech sounds, our spatial targets are going to be our vocal tract, because we are moving our articulators so much within our mouth to a certain location, to a certain spatial location, to be able to produce a certain speech sound. Agreed? According to the spatial target model, there is an internalized map of the vocal tract. VT means vocal tract here in the brain. So there is a place called homunculus in your brain, which is close to your premotor cortex. Okay, and that homunculus has different representations for different areas of your body. There is more fine motor control and there is more motor firing for our speech related muscles compared to our walking and other gross movements. Okay, so there is an internalized map of the vocal tract in the brain, and our articulators are moved to specific regions within the vocal tract. So if I think about a specific speech sound, each articulator is moved to a specific region in my vocal tract to produce those speech sounds. For example, even vowels. E, right? Now, according to the spatial target, you are moving your articulators depending on what your starting point is. So, if I had to talk about isolation, the starting point is how you want your speech sound to be. But if I talked about co-articulation, where I'm producing very many different speech sounds at the same time, for the context sensitivity, my articulator movement varies for each kind of speech sound according to that context, if that makes any sense. So if I said versus just in isolation, for example, if I just said and then I use the vowel sound like in I probably wouldn't get the right. I'm trying to think of a word that has the sound in it. Acknowledge, right? In that word, my starting point for is going to be the same, but the other speech sounds are going to vary depending on what the previous sound articulators were. Okay, so co-articulation will determine how your articulator's starting point is. Maybe you're not even going to the actual starting point, but you're moving it in different ways because you know what spatial target you need to achieve to produce speech sound. So for example, I'm trying to now produce the word hot with and without an object in my mouth. The object in my mouth is going to be actually a pen. Okay, so hot, 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 hot. Now, sample 1 was the one without the pen, and sample 2 was with the pen. I want you to tell me if you heard a difference between the two sounds. I wish I was in class, because you can give me this answer in discussion board, but if I don't give you an answer now, you won't understand what the spatial target I'm talking about. So I want you to think about it, but I'm still going to give you the answer here. That hot sounded almost the same with and without an object in the mouth. So which means I'm making some instantaneous changes in my vocal tract spatial movements of my articulators to achieve that particular sound of how I want it to sound. So if I had the pen in the mouth and without the pen in the mouth, my heart almost sounded the same. It might be slightly different, but you probably understood what I was trying to say. So which means the movement for a particular sound is not invariant. You've probably heard this concept of invariance in your speech perception lecture, where Dr. Fagelson has talked about it. So meaning you can produce speech sound in different ways, and you can move the articulators in different ways to reach your particular target, and it does not have to have the exact same spatial target or spatial location to produce a speech sound. That's what I think I'm getting with all these explanations I'm trying to give you here, is that a speech sound is variable and it's not invariant. Okay, so which means I can achieve the same target by changing the spatial location of articulators in my mouth. And that's one of the reasons how we were able to address context sensitivity issues, right? I am not a native speaker of English, right? My vocal tract spatial targets are different than a native speaker spatial targets, right? My vowel sounds are different from your vowel sounds. But you're still able to, for the most part, I wouldn't say, I don't know if I'm 100% intelligible, that you have to tell me, but for the most part, I consider myself intelligible. And yet I'm able to get across my speech production, my point to you, which means speech sounds are invariant. You're able to understand what I'm able to say or what I'm trying to say, right? So, spatial target, meaning I'm trying to convey, so I'm moving my articulators in my mouth to different spatial locations, and I get the output of what I want to get. Okay. I'm going to skip the slide, you don't need to know that. The next target that I'm going to talk about is the acoustic auditory target. So we talked about spatial, now I'm going to talk about hearing. The goal to be achieved is the acoustic output. What is that you're trying to say? Do you hear it, what you want to say, right? So the articulatory movements to achieve the target may vary. So, as I said, different articulatory movements can be used to achieve a particular speech sound. I'm a classic example of that, dialectal variations with vowel perception. If I go, ooh, 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 and I wish you could see me, because with ooh, you are rounding your lips, and I did ooh with and without rounding your lips, and I actually want you to try it at home as part of this and tell me in your discussion board if you actually heard the difference. Was the oohs different when you produced it with and without rounding the lips, or were they the same, and why did you think so? And also the same thing that I want you to do with spatial target, with the word hot, I want you to produce the word hot with and without some object in your mouth, and I want you to tell me if you perceive them the same or different. Okay, so it depends. The acoustic auditory target, the way we produce our speech sounds in order to get the final output, will depend on the adjacent speech sounds, your rate of speech, my stress patterns, etc. So you want to be able to hear what I'm trying to say. So for example, if I'm going to say the word auditory acoustic target or acoustic auditory target, my goal is for you to hear those words acoustic auditory target. But my movements might be different, might not be exactly the same, but you're able to understand that. So the goal to be able to perceive something, you can perceive the same thing by varying the articulatory positions, which again brings me to the point that speech is variable and it's not invariant. So in order for us to talk about a speech production model, and in terms of a target model, I would say that a target model is a combination of articulator space and acoustic space to achieve the goal. So it's not just vocal tract configuration, it's not just your acoustic auditory output, but it's a combination of that vocal tract targets and the auditory acoustic target, which results in speech production. Okay. So let's think through this one more time. We talked about target models. Target models is what kind of targets do you produce or do you use to achieve your final output, which is the speech. There are two kinds of targets. We talked about the acoustic target and the spatial targets. Spatial targets are saying that there is a certain representation of your vocal tract in the brain, and then you use those vocal tract spatial locations to produce your output. But we also said that speech is variable, it's not invariant, so you could use different spatial locations to produce the same speech sounds. Comes back to the auditory acoustic target where I'm saying the exact same thing. My output is for you to hear what I'm trying to say. I can use different articulatory movements and you can still hear that by varying the spatial targets. So which means to say speech again is um, it's variable and it's not invariant. Okay, so I want you to be able to do the word hot, with and without a pen or an object in your mouth, and tell me whether you perceived it the same or different. I want you to produce the vowel sound ooh with and without rounding your lips, and tell me how you perceive those. Okay. Then another model that we're going to talk about is speech production models and language behavior. So far, if you looked at the models that I talked about, the Connectionist model, the target models, the dynamic models, the dynamic systems model, and the feedback model, all I talked about was speech production, and I never talked about how language plays a role in speech, right? It's very important. What I've been addressing so far is the segmental aspects of speech, which is your consonant and vowel production. But we've never talked about rhythm or prosody because that usually gets neglected in speech production models. So I think for anybody to understand somebody's speech, it's not just the segmentals. Yes, segmentals is important. Your articulation of consonants and vowels plays a huge role in how you understand a person, but the intelligibility is also affected if somebody does not use suprasegmentals. And you know what the suprasegmentals are? Three suprasegmental features are intonation, stress, and duration. So if there is a difference in stress patterns, if there is a difference in intonation patterns, that's going to affect somebody's intelligibility as well. So speech production models have to consider stress patterning as well. For example, if I said, today the content of the lecture is, you're going to be like, what? What did she say? When in fact I should say the contents of today's lecture is or are, and that is what helps you perceive or understand what somebody is speaking. Okay, so this is not a specific model. This is not a model that has a name, but this is a model which we would incorporate suprasegmentals with the segmental aspect of speech production. Okay. The final thing that we're going to talk about is neural models of speech production. The neural model identifies different parts in the nervous system that controls various aspects of speech. If you remember, there are different lobes in the brain. Each lobe has different areas that are responsible for speech. For example, the frontal lobe has Broca's area, which is responsible for your production, execution of the speech sounds. Your Wernicke area is there for comprehension. Then you have the motor cortex that helps in planning and programming, right? So all of those areas are very important in understanding speech production. That is how we know that if somebody has something going on, like with dysarthria, which is an execution problem, versus aphasia and apraxia of speech, which are planning and programming issues, you need to know different areas in the brain that affects it. So let me slow down and tell you those. You've had your intro lecture, so you should know by now what dysarthria is, right? Where there is an execution issue where the intelligibility of speech is affected. Then you have aphasia, where language and speech production may be affected depending on which lobe is affected in the brain. And then you have apraxia of speech, which is also a planning and programming error problem. So you need to be able to know what are different parts in the nervous system that controls various aspects of speech. Only then you know that yes, if the norms control, if in healthy individuals, those are the areas that are controlled. If that area gets affected in an individual that has a disorder, then you will know what kind of issue is going on with that client. So in sum, with this lecture, we're saying that overall, not one model, not a single model can effectively address all the aspects of models of speech production, right? but every aspect of each model or one or other aspect of each model may play a very important role in understanding the process of speech production. All right, so to sum up, we talked about the connectionist model. A classic example is the Dell's model. We talked about the dynamic systems model, and connectionist model is the only one that addresses all the three issues of speech production. Then the dynamic system model talks about decreasing the degrees of freedom by involving synergies or grouping linkages of the different muscle groups. Then we talked about the feedback models, and we said there are lots of issues with the feedback model. Specifically, it's very slow, it's after the fact, it does not really address context sensitivity issues. And then we talked about the target model, which has the spatial target and the acoustic target. We emphasize very clearly there how speech is variable and it's not invariant. Okay, and those models will address for context sensitivity issues a lot, and it talks about the seed ordering issue as well. Okay. And then we talked about how these models so far have only talked about the segmental aspects, but we need to come up with a model that also addresses the suprasegmental aspects, because stress and duration and intonation play a huge role in the speech production process as well. And finally, we talked about the neural aspects of speech production, where neural models talk about different areas in the brain that are responsible for speech production processes, how there is different areas in the brain that are responsible for planning, programming, and execution of the speech. And aphasia and apraxia are disorders of planning and programming, while dysarthria is a disorder of execution. So you need to know the normal areas, or in a healthy person, what are the areas that light up when those processes are involved. And if a certain area is affected, we will know in the disordered population what kind of errors to expect. And then in sum, we said that models, one model cannot explain everything. We have to consider overall and take different parts of different models to help us in the speech production, to understand the process of speech production. All right. So that sums up all lectures for this course. I hope you enjoyed the course. I'm going to post a study guide for your final. 45% of your questions from the final are going to be from your, actually, you know what? I will post a separate link for that so that it doesn't get lost in all of this information about the models. All right.